thank you so much for joining this third in our June Bite-Sized Corrosion series, where we're looking at maritime corrosion. My name is Vanessa Seeley-Fisher, and it really is my great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And I hope that you find our discussion informative, and that as you leave us today, you will feel that you've learned something valuable and that you are eager to continue your journey in understanding corrosion a little bit more. Now, the last time we gathered, we had fascinating discussions on various aspects of marine corrosion. And if you missed those, they are on our isifundi training channel on YouTube. You will not regret spending time listening to those discussions. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Fulufhelo Sithole to the microphone with me. Fulufhelo is an engineer based in the Simonstown Naval Base in Cape Town, and he heads up the Navy's fight against corrosion. And a very warm welcome to you, Fulufhelo. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me today, Vanessa, and I'm truly pleased.
Now, Fulufhelo, I'd love to hear a brief story about how you came to join the fight against corrosion in the Navy.
My background of my study site has been in chemical engineering, though I dropped out. I must indicate the first time I did that, I dropped out. Then I went back to school to study what is regarded as applied chemistry at UKZN. I then completed my degree. Then later on, I also went to join UCT, and that's where I studied material science and engineering. Although I've also studied other things, I don't think they're much related for corrosion at the moment. Then there was a challenge that we were experiencing in our vessels, and it was as a result of MIC, microbial-induced corrosions, but it was also a combination of other corrosion-related issues. I think by the time I had a very senior admiral whom I had engaged with, and at a time there was already a known problem in the area, and the cause of that, it was the bacteria. To be precise, it's a sulfate-reducing bacteria that was a cause of a concern at the time. And they wanted a solution at a time, and I was quite keen to look into the issue. And it took me about a month to understand what were the cause of the issue. From that time till date, I have been so much in love with corrosion and understanding the maritime space, among other things that I've shown interest on.
Thanks, Fulufhelo. It's wonderful to hear that. Whenever I teach a course, I always tell the students that about 30 odd years ago, I started a love affair with corrosion. And it's wonderful to find a kindred spirit who also enjoys, obviously not the corrosion, but the interesting aspects of corrosion that we can learn more about. Now, last week in our discussion with John Lusty about corrosion and its impacts on the magnetic signatures of ships, I was fascinated to discover the importance of cathodic protection to help in reducing these ships' detectability. And now you've mentioned microbial corrosion, which obviously is a different form of corrosion. And I'm sure the reasons that the corrosion interests you are more than just whether we can keep our vessels hidden in foreign waters. Before we get going too much on the corrosion, we start with the corrosion related to fouling, and we talk about marine fouling almost interchangeably. And perhaps some of our audience aren't familiar with those terms. Would you like to just describe a little bit what is fouling and why it's a worry?
Perhaps also, let me just then elaborate a little bit more on what marine fouling entails. Marine fouling is an accumulation of any unwanted biological material that precisely happen when the surface is submerged. This would be structures such as the underwater hull of the ships. It could be on the offshore structures as long as they are submerged underwater, or it can even happen on underwater pipelines. So in this case, the way how it happens, this is because the material or the organisms such as your algae, your barnacles, your mussels, and other marine life get attached to the surface of the structure which is submerged underwater. So that is how marine fouling happens. You touched a bit on cathodic protection. I must also reflect that definitely cathodic protection is one of the means at which it gets to be placed under the water in a means to combat corrosion. But in vessel, there's also what is regarded as impressed current cathodic protection. There's also what we also considered as paint systems, which get to be built up in order to protect the underwater structures, including the vessels in this case. And this is when build-up of paint from your primer, from your intermediate, until you even put your last coat, including what we called as anti-fouling paints. So these are the things that we get to do. And also marine fouling, it's a very, very serious problem, especially in our maritime space. And the concerns of these are quite big. It includes from your increased drag and fuel consumption. And this is happening at the same time, damaging your structures. At the same time, they have environmental impact, operational efficiency. It also increases your maintenance cost. So definitely marine fouling is something that we should be looking out for and trying to find solutions on how we can make our vessels last longer or our underwater structures last longer. Among other things, it also increases your maintenance costs, as I've also indicated.
So it's quite interesting. We don't think of these, shall we call them, unwanted companions on our structures. When they sort of set up home and move in, they do create more challenges than we like. I think the economic aspects of the fouling are something that we can look at. But what I think I just want to reiterate to our audience right now is the fouling in and of itself does not cause the corrosion. It causes a lot of challenges, but it's the fact that it provides a space for the microbes to start to grow that I think is really where we need to consider from a corrosion point of view, is that the corrosion is not caused by the fouling in and of itself, but more by the interaction between the environment that they create and the structures. And I'm sure you've seen some interesting damage caused by microbial corrosion during your time with the Navy.
That is correct. I think I must also reflect, because when you have what we'll then regard as microbial-induced corrosion, part of, like you have correctly mentioned, that the fouling is not the cause, but fouling creates an environment that then brings about corrosion or make it possible. But your MIC is a form of corrosion which is caused by metabolic activities of microorganisms. So these microbes, which will then include your bacteria, your fungi, and sometimes your algae, once they have adhered on your metal surfaces, they then create what is called biofilms. So within these biofilms, there are microorganisms that produce the corrosive substances. And these substances include your acids, it includes your sulfides and other metabolites that also accelerate the deterioration of your metal. And then the context of this is when we understand that is when then you will begin to have your accelerated corrosion, which then will significantly speed up the rate of corrosion compared to when you have abiotic processes. And this can also lead to premature failure of your metal components and structures on naval vessels or any other structure as long as it is submerged underwater. And this will be affecting the integrity and the safety of your structure. So over and above even the economical aspect, there's also a safety of lives that are involved into this. So it's just beyond what monies can buy. It has also an impact on the life of the people that are serving on those platforms.
That's so true. And I think we often forget to consider that life is actually what we're trying to preserve, and keeping the ships afloat and structures built as they should be helps in that preservation of life. I remember our discussion with Dr. Riza a little while ago on bite-sized corrosion. We did a lovely discussion with him on microbial corrosion, and we didn't focus at all on marine corrosion. So it's quite interesting to me to find that these sulfate-reducing bacteria are not only in the muds and clays and waters on land, but can also be found in the marine environment, and they can do hideous damage.
There are structures that have already, sunk. And when you look also in the broader naval environments, US Navy has also had one of their old battleship that also sank as a result of sulfate-reducing bacteria. Although this information is there in articles, there are also many other structures that have sank as a result of microbes, including sulfate-reducing bacteria. Because the activities of these bacteria, like I have also mentioned, they accelerate the rate of corrosion. And this can even happen within 6 months. A metal that is as thick sometimes as about 10 to 16 millimeter, for this microbes is nothing. And you find that the holes are there, once the biofilm is there, very little you can do to mitigate using your paint or using your CP system. So even sometimes the addition of what we regard as zinc anodes, even when you put them around the surrounding area, the moment you have these microbes in that space, you can no longer use that means. And that's why at that time, the one thing that we have also adopted is the use of divers. Because once you have them creating an environment for themselves, you know that unless you disturb that, that structure is gone. So that's how aggressive they are. And they entirely compromise your structure. Your structural integrity gets to be compromised, and it doesn't end up on the hull. It's also happen in your pipes. It also happen in other critical systems that you have in the vessel. This leads to even potential leaks, mechanical failures, even increased maintenance needs. I mean, what if now your vessel is said to be sailing? What then happens when you have circumstances like this? So automatically, it has impacted your operational ability. You are no longer able to sail. You are no longer able to conduct the service which you are supposed to do.
Now, that's interesting. You made mention a little while ago about the challenges with the marine growth. In terms of the cathodic protection, on land, we consider that the formation of the calcareous deposits are beneficial in reducing how much current we need. And I would have thought that calcareous deposits could also be marine in nature. If you can establish cathodic protection and that sort of cathodic film early on, have you found that to inhibit the growth of microbials or microbes in MIC? I know that we need higher levels of cathodic protection to halt the corrosion under conditions of MIC than we would normally. So that we do know. But I just wondered whether you'd found that if we can get cathodic protection on early enough, does that seem to inhibit the MIC?
So let me then also just try to systematically unpack this. Your cathodic protection has its own limits. Even the number of your zinc anodes that you may want to introduce, you must also then do that with caution. Because also if you put more, you introduce another problem. So it's almost a balancing game. But we then understand that microbes, they are things that they don't like. Maybe it doesn't taste nice to them, but but you also have limitations, because sometimes when this biofilm environment start to happen, you may not even notice that you have such an environment, because these things is happening underwater. So one of the best thing you can ever do is underwater surveillance. So if you then introduce your underwater surveillance, it gives you more propensity to see the areas where now becoming susceptible to corrosion. And part of that, especially when you have scratch on your paint, you know these are the areas that you are more prone to formation of microbes in that space, because then you would have tried to use all your antifouling, but then they also have a limitation because they also have their lifespan. Because part of what we have done as well was to use a whole range of paint systems and different products, and we have even submerged them. We find that at best, some they last you 6 months. And in worst case scenarios, 3 months is even too much. And now you then realize actually to protect your structure, it's a combination. It may not even be one approach. It may be a combination. You need to intertwine your cathodic protection. Sometimes you also need to introduce your ICCP. Sometimes you need to introduce your best paint systems as well. At the same time, you may even have to put in, as we indicated earlier, submerge extra anodes to try to mitigate that. So it comes almost as a combination. There is no one size fits all. So that is one lesson that for the years that I've been in corrosion space, that's one thing that I've learned, that you hardly have a one size fits all. And it makes sense because the metals themselves, they want to go back to nature.
Exactly. That's
So,
always the challenge with corrosion, is that everything's trying to go back to its least energetic state.
that is correct.
I'm sure that you've also seen some of the impact of corrosion on the various vessels due to the severe fouling and so on. Have you seen some horror stories that you'd like to warn people about, where there's been challenges and what you've perhaps done about it?
From the broader perspective and also from the studies perspective, so it's a combination of number of things that I've experienced, observed, and learned as well. Definitely, corrosion, number one, is quite costly. It can be very detrimental. Part of what I've also reflected earlier was the impact it has on your machineries. It damages a lot of things. As a result of that, you end up damaging your engines, you damage your machineries, you damage a whole lot of equipments which you may even have on board. Corrosion itself, it also comes at a cost sometimes of even lives. So if this is not detected earlier and addressed, it can have many catastrophic failures. I know sometimes some of the vessels that get to sink at sea, it gets to be mentioned to be many other things. But once you understand corrosion, you know some of them were actually due to corrosion. But obviously, we need to detect these issues early and apply, apply number of things, because corrosion itself is not just one side to it. It also have environmental impacts that it brings about, Just think of a tanker, for instance, its structure perforate, and all those gasoline just get and the oil spill over the ocean, the impact it has on the marine lives. So there's a lot of things that we need from economical aspect, from environmental aspect, even from the life aspect, which we need to look into. So corrosion has a huge cost. It can even increase our premiums, the insurance, We need to do a lot. I don't think we have done sufficient enough, either as a country or the professionals in the corrosion space, to address the issue of corrosion. I think what we have done, we have just touched the surface. There's a lot that still needs to be done. There's a lot of studies that still need to be done, even research. Because I remember when I was doing my project with UCT, you struggle to find materials which are written, even locally, that talks about corrosion. So you then tend to rely on information that has been written outside. Even that is still not exhaustive. Maybe another thing which I must indicate, which sometimes we forget. I don't know if you may have heard of this, but I can share this with confidence. Corrosion is also area-based. So it's quite interesting that the kind of corrosion that we may experience, let's say in Simonstown, is it has a different context from what happens in Durban. It has a different context from what happens in PE. So you then need more functionaries to also understand corrosion from its own environment and the impossible impacts that it may also bring to those spaces. So these are some of the things that you then realize, actually, there are gaps. We need to do more. That's what I can say, Vanessa. We haven't done enough.
Exactly, Fulufhelo. This has been fascinating discussion. Thank you. And I completely concur with you that there's such a dearth of information about corrosion. And I guess that's why we gather, as we do at Bite-Sized Corrosion, is to try and increase just an awareness of corrosion, because as we increase an awareness, so we increase the desire to find out more. And through that, we'll find there's more research, more understanding, and hopefully less corrosion down the line. But I've learned so much from you. Thank you for your time today, for chatting with us about biofouling and microbial-induced corrosion and its impact on the Navy being greater than just the hole that is made in the metal, but also the possibility of it affecting the drag, the cost of running the ship because of the extra fuel and so on. And those are some aspects that I don't think we necessarily give enough attention to. So thank you for sharing with us that there are solutions that you're working on, but also that there are work areas that need solutions to be developed. I think that's very helpful too.